The alley off Moran Street smelled like rust and old rain, the kind of place where the streetlights flickered just enough to make shadows move but never enough to make you feel safe. And somewhere between the graffiti-tagged brick walls and a forgotten wicker laundry basket, Valerius Dragos, the most feared Korean mafia boss in the city's underworld, lay bleeding out on cold asphalt in a charcoal three-piece suit worth more than most people in that neighborhood made in a year. 3 bullets. 2 in his side. One that had kissed his shoulder and kept going. His men hadn't found him yet. His enemies thought he was already dead. And the only person in that alley who gave a single damn about whether he lived or died was 6 years old. Her name was Odette Miller. And she had only come outside to fetch the laundry. She was small for her age, a little girl with natural puffs of dark hair pinned back with a rubber band, wearing a green sweatshirt 2 sizes too big that still had last winter's bleach stain on the sleeve. She lived with Ms. Clara in the 3rd row house on the left, the woman who had opened her home and her heart to Odette 4 years ago, after a rainy Tuesday on Route 9 had stolen both of Odette's parents in one terrible moment and left a 2-year-old girl with nothing but a social worker's file and a pink hospital blanket. Ms. Clara wasn't rich. She wasn't young. But she had looked at that little girl and decided, without hesitation, that love was a choice you made, not a condition you were born into. The cracked window patched with tape, the front step that wobbled when you stood on it wrong, none of that had ever stopped her from making sure Odette felt like she belonged somewhere in this world. Odette knew this alley the way only children who grow up in hard places know things, every loose stone, every shortcut, every face that didn't belong. And this face, pale as ash and sharp as a blade even in unconsciousness, absolutely did not belong here. She should have run. Every grown-up instinct she hadn't yet developed would have told her to drop the basket and go get Ms. Clara. But Odette Miller stood there for exactly 3 seconds, watching the slow spread of dark red soaking through the man's white dress shirt, and then she did what 6-year-olds who haven't yet learned the cost of caring sometimes do. She knelt down beside him. Her small hands found the lapels of his jacket and gripped them the way you grip something when you're trying to hold the whole world together. And then she leaned close to his ashen face, close enough to feel the shallow, stuttering warmth of his breath, and she whispered the only prayer she knew how to make in that moment. "Don't die, please don't die." Now here is what you need to understand about Valerius Dragos before we go any further, because this story only hits as hard as it should if you understand exactly who was lying on that ground. Valerius was 38 years old, Korean-born, and had built his criminal empire from nothing but calculation, patience, and a reputation for being the kind of man who never raised his voice because he never needed to. He stood 6'2" in his dress shoes, the Italian kind, hand-stitched, always polished, and he wore his authority the way other men wore cologne. Quietly. Everywhere. Impossible to ignore. His organization, known in certain circles only as the Dragos Syndicate, controlled import networks, private security contracts, and 3 city districts worth of street-level operations. He had lawyers on retainer who had never lost a case. He had associates who communicated in code over encrypted lines. He had a penthouse that looked out over the city like a throne room, where he sat every night and reviewed reports the way a surgeon reviews X-rays, clinical, precise, and completely unmoved by what he saw. People feared him. That was not an accident. Fear, in Valerius's world, was the only currency that never lost its value. It was the only thing he had ever truly trusted. In 48 hours, he had been scheduled to sign an agreement that would have doubled his territory and buried his last remaining rival. Instead, his rival had found out. And 3 hired guns had turned a routine transit route through the Moran Street district into an ambush that his own intelligence team had not seen coming. 2 of his bodyguards were dead. His driver had managed to get the call out before the 3rd shooter had ended that conversation permanently. Valerius had taken the hits, kept moving on instinct, the way men who've survived this long always do, and then his legs had simply stopped cooperating somewhere between the alley entrance and nowhere at all. He had been unconscious for 11 minutes when Odette found him. And now the most powerful and dangerous man in the city's criminal underworld was lying with his head resting against a wicker laundry basket, Miss Clara's laundry basket, filled with the clean sheets Odette had been sent to collect before supper, being kept company by a child who pressed both of her small hands against the bloodied side of his jacket and refused, absolutely refused, to move. That silver watch on his wrist that she couldn't stop looking at. It cost more than Ms. Clara's entire year of rent. She didn't know that. She also didn't know that the black luxury SUV now turning hard into the far end of the alley, headlights blazing, tires screaming against the wet asphalt, was carrying 4 of the most heavily armed men in the city, all of them frantic, all of them trained to remove witnesses who saw things they shouldn't have seen. She didn't know that the man in the suit running ahead of the vehicle, phone still pressed to his ear, was Valerius's most trusted lieutenant, a man named Jin-ho Seo, who had spent the last 12 minutes making calls that had sent shockwaves through 3 different criminal networks. All she knew was that the man on the ground was still breathing. And she was not going to let go. If this opening already has you gripped, hit that like button right now to support the story. Drop a comment and tell me, did you expect a child to be the one to save him? Share this with someone who loves a slow-burn story with a real emotional twist. And subscribe to Mafia Moonlight Tales for a brand new gripping episode every single day. Now, let's go back to that alley. Because Jin-ho Seo's headlights just hit Odette's green sweatshirt. And what he does next is going to change everything. Jin-ho Seo had seen a lot of things in 12 years of working for Valerius Dragos. He had seen boardroom negotiations that ended in violence. He had watched his boss walk out of situations that should have been impossible to walk out of. He had learned, over time, to keep his face neutral and his hands steady no matter what was in front of him. But when the SUV's headlights swept the length of that alley and he saw the shape on the ground, saw the suit, saw the watch, saw the absolute stillness of the man he served, Jin-ho's face did something it almost never did. It broke. He was already running before the vehicle had fully stopped, the gravel crunching under his dress shoes, his hand instinctively moving toward the weapon at his hip before his brain caught up with his eyes and registered what else was in that frame. A child. A small girl in a green sweatshirt, kneeling on the wet asphalt beside Valerius Dragos, both hands pressed flat against his side, her face tilted down toward his with the kind of focused, desperate concentration you only see in people who genuinely believe that if they just try hard enough, they can hold someone in this world by sheer force of will. Jin-ho stopped 3 feet away. Behind him, he heard his men spill out of the vehicle, heard the sound of weapons being readied, heard someone say the boss's name in a voice that was barely holding itself together. But Jin-ho stood very still, because the girl had looked up at him now, and her eyes, dark and wide and completely unafraid in a way that made no logical sense given the 4 armed men surrounding her, had gone to the gun at his hip, and then come back up to his face, and she had said, in a voice that was steadier than it had any right to be. He's still breathing. But you have to hurry. Jin-ho Seo would later tell people, only the very few people he ever spoke honestly to, that in that moment, something shifted in him that he couldn't name and didn't fully understand. This child who had no business being in this alley, who had no reason in the world to care about a stranger bleeding on the ground, had stayed. Had pressed her hands against the wound. Had whispered prayers into the dark. Had not run when the headlights came. He thought briefly about what kind of person raised a child like this. What kind of home produced this kind of quiet courage in a 6-year-old girl? He didn't know yet that the answer was a modest row house 3 doors down, a woman named Ms. Clara who had chosen this child when the world had already discarded her, and had raised her, in the middle of all this grit and hardship, to still believe that a stranger's life was worth fighting for. He crouched down in front of her, slowly, and looked her in the eye. "You kept him alive," he said quietly. She looked back at him with the kind of seriousness that only children can pull off without it feeling like performance. "I know," she said. "So don't let him die now." 48 hours before he ended up bleeding on Moran Street, Valerius Dragos was standing at the floor-to-ceiling window of his 42nd-floor penthouse, holding a glass of single malt whiskey that cost more per bottle than most people's monthly salary, watching the city below him the way a chess player watches a board he has already decided to win. He never paced. Never fidgeted. Never let his hands do anything that suggested uncertainty. These were habits he had built deliberately, the same way he had built everything else in his life, with patience, with precision, and with the absolute understanding that in his world, the moment you showed weakness was the moment someone began calculating how to use it against you. He was dressed, even at 11 o'clock at night, in a charcoal three-piece suit with a pale silver tie. His dark hair was swept back cleanly from a face that people often described, in hushed conversations he was never supposed to hear, as almost unfairly handsome, sharp jawline, steady dark eyes, the kind of composed expression that gave nothing away and took everything in. On his left wrist, a brushed steel timepiece that had been a gift to himself on the day he had finally eliminated the last man who had ever dared to underestimate him. He had grown up in Seoul with nothing. A father who disappeared before he could form a memory of him. A mother who worked herself hollow in a factory that paid her barely enough to keep the lights on. Valerius had watched her hands age 20 years in 10, and he had made himself a promise so early that it had calcified into something closer to religion. He would never be powerless again. Not for anyone. Not for anything. By 22, he had his first operation running. By 27, he had buried his first rival. By 35, he had built the Dragos Syndicate into something that made powerful men in expensive rooms go quiet when his name came up in conversation. He did not consider himself a cruel man. Cruelty, in his estimation, was inefficient, the tool of people who led with emotion rather than strategy. He was simply a man who understood the mechanics of power with a clarity that most people spent their entire lives avoiding. Fear was a lever. Loyalty was a resource. And mercy, as far as he had ever been able to tell, was a luxury that the underworld did not extend to anyone, so there was very little point in offering it yourself. He had no wife. No children. No one who waited up for him. He had Jin-ho, his most trusted lieutenant. He had a network of associates who respected him absolutely and trusted him conditionally. And he had this city, spread out 42 floors below him like an empire he had assembled one calculated move at a time. He took a slow sip of his whiskey. He did not know that in 48 hours, all of it, the suit, the watch, the carefully constructed invincibility, would be lying in the dirt of a back alley. And that the only thing standing between him and death would be a 6-year-old girl in a bleach-stained sweatshirt who had never once been taught that some people aren't worth saving. Miss Clara had asked her twice to fetch the laundry before supper, and Odette had forgotten twice, because she had been watching a line of ants carry something 3 times their size across the kitchen floor and she had needed to see how the story ended. The ants made it. She was satisfied. So by the time she finally pulled on her green sweatshirt and picked up the wicker basket from behind the back door, the sun had already gone down and the alley was lit by nothing but the single street lamp that worked and the pale blue glow that always seemed to settle over Moran Street after dark like a held breath. Miss Clara had told her not to dawdle. Miss Clara had also told her not to talk to strangers, not to touch anything on the ground, and not to go past the 3rd drain cover under any circumstances. Odette knew all the rules. She was very good at knowing them. She was less consistently good at following them. She had just pulled the last of the dried sheets from the line, the one that always snagged on the rusted hook and needed 2 hands and a specific angle, when she heard it. Not a voice. Not footsteps. Just a sound like something heavy settling against the ground, a slow exhale that didn't belong to the alley's usual nighttime grammar of distant traffic and stray cats and the Mendez family's television bleeding through a thin wall. She turned around. He was just lying there. Her first thought, in the completely honest and unfiltered way that 6-year-olds have thoughts, was that he looked like a prince. Not a real one, she wasn't a baby, she knew real princes didn't exist in places like Moran Street. But the kind from the books Ms. Clara read to her sometimes, the ones with the dark hair and the serious faces and the fancy clothes that never had stains on them. Except this one did have a stain. A dark, spreading one on his white shirt, just below where his jacket had fallen open. And his face, which was sharp and clean-lined even now, had gone the color of old newspaper. She stood very still for 3 full seconds. She thought about Ms. Clara. She thought about the rules. She thought about the ants, and how they hadn't stopped, hadn't turned around, hadn't put down what they were carrying just because it was heavy. Then she set the laundry basket down, walked across the alley, and knelt beside him on the cold asphalt. Up close, he smelled like something expensive she had no name for, underneath the copper smell of blood. His hands were large and still. The watch on his wrist caught the street lamp light and threw it back like a small quiet star. She pressed both her palms flat against the dark stain on his jacket the way she'd once seen someone do on television, and she leaned down close to his face, and she said the only thing that felt true. "Don't die. Please don't die." She did not know who he was. She did not know what he had done or what he was capable of or how many people in this city trembled at the sound of his name. She only knew he was breathing. Barely. And that for reasons she couldn't have explained to anyone, that felt like something worth fighting for. She heard the car before she saw it. A low, engine-deep rumble that rolled into the alley the way thunder rolls before a storm, felt in the chest before it registers in the ears. Then the headlights came around the corner and hit everything at once, turning the alley white and sharp and suddenly very small, and Odette did the only thing that made sense to her in that moment. She didn't move. She stayed exactly where she was, both palms still pressed against the man's side, and she turned her face toward the light the way you turn toward something you've decided not to be afraid of, even if your heartbeat is doing something complicated inside your ribs. The vehicle stopped hard. Doors opened before the engine did. And then there were men, 4 of them, big and fast and dressed in dark suits that made them look like they had been cut from the same shadow, moving into the alley with a speed and precision that told Odette, in the wordless way that children understand dangerous things, that these were not the kind of men who knocked before entering anywhere. The one in front was already running. He was lean and sharp-faced, Korean like the man on the ground, with close-cropped hair and eyes that were scanning everything at once, the walls, the drains, the roofline, the body, and his hand had gone to his hip before he had fully registered what his eyes were telling him. Which was that the person kneeling beside Valerius Dragos, both hands pressed against his wound, was not an enemy. Was not even close to an enemy. Was, in fact, a small girl with puffed hair and a bleach-stained sweatshirt who was looking directly at him without flinching. He stopped. Behind him, she heard the unmistakable mechanical sound of weapons being readied, and she understood it for what it was even if she couldn't name it, and her hands pressed down harder against the jacket because she had made a decision and she was not undoing it just because things had gotten louder. The man in front crouched down slowly, the way adults sometimes do when they are trying very hard not to frighten a child, and she could see in his face that something was happening behind his eyes that he hadn't prepared for. His jaw was tight. His hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady. She spoke first. "He's still breathing. But you have to hurry." The man stared at her for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then he looked down at Valerius, at the small hands pressed against the wound that had, by any reasonable medical estimation, bought his boss just enough time, and something moved across his face that he didn't try to hide. He looked back at her. "You kept him alive," he said quietly. Odette held his gaze with the particular steadiness of someone who has already decided that the hardest part is over. "I know," she said. "So don't let him die now." For one suspended moment, the alley was completely silent, for armed men, one dying mafia boss, and a 6-year-old girl who had no idea she had just changed all of their lives. Then Jin-ho Seo straightened up, turned to his men, and his voice came out low and absolute. "Get the medic on the line. Now." Nobody argued. Nobody ever argued with that voice. And as the alley erupted into controlled, urgent movement around her, Odette finally lifted her hands from the man's side and looked down at her palms, dark with blood that wasn't hers, and she thought that she was probably going to be late getting the laundry back to Ms. Clara. She thought Ms. Clara would understand. He woke up to white. White ceiling. White walls. The soft, filtered hum of medical equipment that cost more per hour than most hospitals charged per day. A private clinic, one of 3 that the Dragos Syndicate kept on quiet retainer for situations that couldn't be explained to emergency room staff without generating the kind of paperwork that ended careers and started investigations. Valerius lay still for a long moment before he moved anything, which was habit. "You assessed first. You always assessed first." He catalogued the information his body was sending him in the measured, clinical way he approached everything: the dull fire in his left side where the surgeon had gone in, the stiffness in his shoulder, the four-line running into the back of his right hand, the fact that he was alive, which was, by any reasonable accounting of the last 48 hours, not the outcome the evening had been trending toward. Jin-ho was asleep in the chair by the door. Upright, jacket still on, the way he always slept when he slept on duty, never fully down, always half listening. Valerius looked at him for a moment, then looked back at the ceiling. His empire was intact. Jin-ho had briefed him in fragments between the clinic and consciousness, the ambush, the losses, the rival family's calculated move, the counter-response already in motion. The machinery of the Dragos Syndicate had kept turning without him, the way it was designed to. In a few days, the men responsible for putting him on that asphalt would understand, in the most final way available, that the attempt had been a mistake. All of that was clear. All of that was manageable. What wasn't manageable, what kept pulling him back every time he tried to file it away and focus on recovery, was the whisper. Don't die. Please don't die. He had been mostly unconscious when she'd said it. He knew that. The rational part of his mind understood that what he had experienced was likely nothing more than sound bleeding through the edges of shock, the random sensory debris of a body shutting down its non-essential systems. It meant nothing. It was the voice of a child who had stumbled onto something she didn't understand and reacted the way children react, with feeling, and without the self-preservation instinct that experience eventually burns into a person. He knew all of that. And yet, he had been doing this for 16 years. He had been shot at before, threatened before, had sat across tables from men who wanted him dead and smiled at them while the thought ran through their minds. He had never once woken up in a recovery room thinking about anything other than the next move. He was thinking about small hands. Hands that had pressed themselves flat against his side in the dark of a back alley, not because they were paid to, not because they were afraid to do otherwise, but for no calculable reason at all. No angle. No leverage. No return on investment. Just, don't die. He stared at the white ceiling for a long time. Then, quietly, so as not to wake Jin-ho, he said into the empty room the question that had no strategic answer, no column in any ledger he had ever kept. Who was she? Jin-ho had learned, over 12 years, to read the specific quality of Valerius's silences. There was the silence that meant he was thinking through a problem. There was the silence that meant he had already solved it and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. There was the silence that meant someone in the room had said something that would cost them later, and they didn't know it yet. The silence on the third morning of recovery was none of those. It was quieter than all of them. And somehow, because of that, louder. Valerius hadn't asked about the ambush response. Hadn't asked for the financial reports Jin-ho had brought. Hadn't touched the encrypted tablet sitting on the bedside table with 3 days of organizational updates loaded onto it. He had sat propped against the clinic pillows with his eyes on the middle distance, and Jin-ho had eventually understood, without being told, that his boss was not thinking about the rival family or the territory or the 2 bodyguards they had buried 2 days ago. He was thinking about the alley. On the 4th morning, Valerius spoke. The girl, he said. No preamble. No context needed. Find her. Jin-ho nodded once, the way he nodded when an instruction was already in motion before it had been spoken out loud. He had known this request was coming. He had, quietly and without being asked, already begun. What followed was a demonstration of exactly why the Dragos Syndicate had never once failed to locate a person it needed to find. Within 6 hours, Jin-ho had cross-referenced the residential records for every row house on the Moran Street block, had pulled utility registrations, had spoken to 2 people in the district who owed the organization significant favors, and had confirmed through a contact at the local school district what he had already suspected from the moment he had looked into those steady, unfrightened eyes in the alley. Her name was Odette Miller. 6 years old. Enrolled in 1st grade at Garner Elementary, 3 blocks from Moran Street. Currently residing with her legal guardian, a 51-year-old woman named Clara, who had formally adopted Odette 4 years ago following the deaths of both biological parents in a road accident on Route 9. Ms. Clara Bowen worked part-time at a laundromat on Clement Avenue and supplemented her income with alterations work she took in on weekends. Her annual earnings placed her, by any objective measure, well below the poverty threshold for a household of 2. Jin-ho laid the file on the bed beside Valerius without a word. Valerius read it slowly. All of it. Which was unusual. He was a man who processed information in seconds and moved on. He read this one twice. He looked at the single photograph Jin-ho had sourced from the school district records. A small girl with natural puffs of dark hair and an expression of absolute seriousness, the kind children wear when they have been told to smile for a photograph and have decided against it. He looked at it for a long time. Then he closed the file, set it on the table, and stared out the clinic window at the gray afternoon sky with the expression of a man who has just discovered that his most carefully constructed belief about the world has a crack running straight through the middle of it. He had built an empire on the certainty that nobody did anything for nothing. That kindness was always a transaction in disguise. That the only honest relationship between people was the one defined by what each stood to gain. A 6-year-old girl with no parents, living in a house with a wobbling front step and a patched window, had knelt in a dirty alley in the dark and pressed her hands against a stranger's wound for no reason that fit inside that framework. No reason at all. "I want to see the neighborhood," Valerius said quietly. "All of it." "Not from a report." Jin-ho looked at him carefully. "You're not cleared to leave yet." "I know," Valerius said. And then, in a tone that settled the conversation completely, "Book it for when I am." He came on a Wednesday evening, 7 days after leaving the clinic, in an unmarked car with tinted windows and no plates that anyone in that neighborhood would have recognized. No convoy. No escort beyond Jin-ho in the driver's seat and one man in the back whose job was to stay invisible. Valerius had been specific about that. He didn't want the neighborhood to feel the weight of his arrival. He wanted to see it the way it actually was, undisturbed, unperformed, honest. He was not prepared for how honest it was. Moran Street in the daytime, he was learning, was a different creature from Moran Street at night. At night, the darkness had softened the edges of things, the way darkness does. In the pale gray light of a Wednesday evening, there were no soft edges. There was only what was there. Graffiti that ran the full length of the east wall in layered colors, not the artistic kind, the territorial kind, the kind that was a message dressed as decoration, marking the block the way a boundary is marked on a map that nobody official was ever going to print. A street lamp on the corner with its glass casing shattered, the bulb long gone, the pole itself leaning at a slight angle as though it had been struck by something and never straightened. 3 of the row houses had boards where windows should have been. 2 had front doors that didn't sit flush in their frames. Jin-ho said nothing. He had grown up in a neighborhood not entirely unlike this one, in a different country, and he understood that there was nothing useful to add. Valerius sat in the back seat and looked. He watched a group of older boys take up position at the far end of the block with the particular studied casualness of people performing a role. He watched a woman hurry past them with her bag held close and her eyes forward, the practiced posture of someone who had calculated the fastest route between every point on this street so many times it had become muscle memory. He watched a child, not Odette, a boy, maybe 8, kick a can against the base of the leaning lamppost and then look up and down the block before going back inside, as though even play required a security check first. Then he saw the 3rd row house on the left. The patched window. The wobbling step. A small pair of shoes left outside the front door, green canvas, worn at the toes, the left one with a fraying lace tied in a double knot the way someone had taught a child to tie it so it wouldn't come undone. He looked at those shoes for a long time. Then he looked back at the block, at the graffiti and the broken lamp and the boys on the corner and the woman who walked with her bag like armor, and something moved through him that was not sentiment, exactly, and not strategy, exactly, but somewhere in the territory between the two where decisions are actually made. He had spent 16 years building walls around things he wanted to protect. He had simply, until this moment, been protecting the wrong things. "I've seen enough," he said quietly. Jin-ho glanced at him in the rear-view mirror, reading his face with the fluency of long practice. "What do you want to do?" he asked. Valerius looked one last time at the small green shoes outside the third door on the left. "Fix it," he said. "All of it." It started small. That was the thing nobody on Moran Street could quite explain later, not the way it began, not the order of it, not who exactly was responsible. It simply started, the way weather starts, with small signs that don't mean anything individually until you look back and realize they were all pointing in the same direction. The first thing was the lamppost. On a Thursday morning, two men in unmarked work gear showed up before the block was fully awake, replaced the shattered casing, straightened the pole, and left without speaking to anyone. No city vehicle. No work order posted. No clipboard. They were gone before Ms. Clara's kettle had finished boiling. The following Monday, the graffiti on the east wall was gone. Not painted over in the sloppy, mismatched way the city sometimes covered it, leaving ghost shapes under cheap gray paint. Gone, properly cleaned, the brick beneath it looking almost new. A woman on the block told her neighbor she had seen a van at 4 in the morning. Her neighbor said she had imagined it. Neither of them pushed the point, because in neighborhoods like this one, unexplained good things made people as nervous as unexplained bad ones. Then the boys on the corner stopped coming. This was the part that people talked about in lowered voices, in kitchens and doorways, in the careful way people discuss things they don't fully understand and aren't sure they want to. The older boys who had claimed the far end of the block, who had been there so long they had become part of the street's landscape, like the leaning lamppost, like the boarded windows, simply weren't there one morning. And the morning after. And the morning after that. Nobody filed a report. Nobody asked official questions. But the people who knew how this city actually worked, beneath the surface of it, understood that there was only one way a territorial claim like that got vacated, that cleanly and that quietly. Someone had made a conversation happen. Someone with enough weight behind their words to make the alternative to agreement feel very clearly not worth considering. The boarded windows were replaced over the course of 2 weeks. New glass, proper frames, no explanation offered or requested. A contractor appeared at the house with the broken front door, fixed it in 40 minutes, refused payment, and drove away in a truck with no company name on the side. Moran Street, slowly and without announcement, was being repaired. The residents felt it before they could name it, a loosening of something that had been pulled tight for so long they had forgotten what it felt like without the tension. Children stayed outside a little later. The woman who had walked with her bag like armor began to let her arm relax, slightly, by degrees, the way a person exhales when they finally believe the danger has passed. None of them knew who was responsible. None of them knew that every instruction, every contractor, every quiet conversation that had cleared the corner had been routed through Jin-ho Seo's encrypted line and approved by a man in a charcoal suit who was repaying a debt that no amount of money was ever going to be large enough to settle. They only knew that something had changed. And for now, that was enough. Ms. Clara knew something was different about the black car parked outside her house on a Saturday afternoon because it was too clean and too still, the way things are when they are being deliberate about themselves. She was standing at her front window with a dish towel in her hands when the knock came, 3 times, measured and unhurried, the knock of someone who was not accustomed to doors not being opened. She smoothed her apron, looked once at Odette sitting cross-legged on the living room floor arranging buttons into categories only she understood, and then she opened the door. The man on the step was tall, dark-haired, and dressed in a charcoal suit that had no business being on Moran Street. Behind him, at a respectful distance, stood another man with close-cropped hair who kept his eyes on the street and his hands visible. In the tall man's hands was a wicker laundry basket, clean and new, the kind with the reinforced handles, filled with groceries, and beneath the groceries, an envelope that Miss Clara would open later and spend a long time sitting quietly with before she allowed herself to react to what was inside it. "My name is Valerius Dragos," he said. And then, because he had rehearsed several versions of this introduction and discarded all of them, he said simply, "I believe your daughter saved my life." Ms. Clara looked at him for a long moment with the particular assessment of a woman who has learned to read people accurately and quickly because the cost of misreading them has always been too high. Then she stepped back and let him in. Odette looked up from her buttons. She tilted her head at him the way she had tilted it in the alley, that same unguarded, direct appraisal, and then her eyes went to the basket in his hands and back to his face, and she said, with the confidence of someone confirming a detail they were already fairly certain of. "You're the man from the alley." "Yes," Valerius said. She considered this. "You have more color now." Something moved across his face that Jin-ho, watching from the doorway, had genuinely never seen there before. It was not quite a smile. It was what lives just behind a smile in people who have forgotten how to let one through. He sat across from her on Miss Clara's worn sofa, and he had prepared things to say, carefully considered words about gratitude and debts and the intention to provide for her security and future, and Odette listened politely to approximately 40 seconds of this before she picked up 2 buttons from the floor and held them out to him. "Do you want to help sort?" she asked. He looked at the buttons in her small palm. Then he set down every carefully prepared word he had brought with him, reached out, and took them. They sorted buttons in silence for a while, the most powerful criminal in the city and the 6-year-old girl who had refused to let him die, and Valerius understood, with a clarity that no amount of strategy had ever given him, that there was no transaction that covered this. No figure in the envelope that settled it. No gesture large enough to balance what a small pair of hands pressed flat in the dark had actually cost her and given him. You could not repay someone for choosing, freely and for nothing, to believe your life was worth saving. You could only try to deserve it. The alley off Moran Street did not transform overnight. That was the thing about real change, it didn't arrive like a revelation. It arrived the way spring arrives, incrementally, in small surrenders of cold to warmth, until one day you looked up and realized the season had shifted without ever announcing itself. The asphalt was resurfaced first. A crew came on a Tuesday before dawn and worked through the morning with a quiet efficiency that had become, by now, the signature of every improvement on this block, purposeful, unhurried, and entirely without explanation. By afternoon, the surface that had been cracked and oil-stained and rough enough to tear a child's knee open was smooth and clean and a shade darker than everything around it, like a sentence that had been corrected. The walls came next. Not cleaned this time, painted. A local artist whose rent had mysteriously become current after months of arrears showed up one morning with 3 assistants and enough paint to cover the entire east and west faces of the alley with something that was the opposite of the territorial graffiti it replaced. It took 4 days. What emerged were murals, large, warm-colored, alive with painted figures that looked like the people who actually lived on this block. Children in motion. Trees with deep roots. A night sky rendered so carefully above the roofline that 2 of the older residents stood looking at it for a long time without saying anything, because sometimes beauty in a place that has been told it doesn't deserve beauty requires a moment of quiet adjustment. Lighting came after that. Proper fixtures mounted at intervals along both walls, warm-toned and steady, the kind that made the space feel held rather than exposed. A small bench appeared at the far end, solid wood, bolted properly to the ground. Then a painted hopscotch grid near the entrance, and beside it, a chalk holder mounted to the wall at the exact height of a child's reach, kept consistently stocked by a method no one on the block investigated too closely. The children came naturally, the way children come to any space that signals it belongs to them. Odette was among the first. On a Saturday morning 3 weeks after the painting was finished, she brought her buttons outside in a small tin and sat on the new bench and arranged them on the smooth surface with the same solemn focus she brought to everything, while around her, 4 other children from the block conducted a hopscotch tournament of significant competitive intensity. She looked up once at the mural on the east wall, at the painted night sky with its careful stars, and then down at the alley floor where, weeks ago, she had knelt beside a dying stranger and made a decision that had quietly rearranged the world. She didn't think about that in those terms. She was 6. She just thought it was a nice place to sit. But somewhere across the city, in a penthouse on the 42nd floor, a man stood at his window looking down at the lights below him, and for the first time in 16 years, what he felt when he looked at this city was not the cold satisfaction of ownership. It was something quieter than that. Something he had no prior word for, but that felt, in the unfamiliar and unguarded way of new things, remarkably like peace. There is a version of this story that ends with the powerful man and the small girl and leaves it at that, a neat, satisfying image, the kind that asks nothing of the person receiving it. But that is not quite what this story is. Because what happened in the alley off Moran Street was not extraordinary in the way we usually mean that word. It was not extraordinary because of who Valerius was, his money, his empire, the particular lethal weight of his reputation. It was extraordinary because of something much simpler and much harder to build than any of that. Odette Miller made a choice. She was 6 years old, with no power, no resources, and no reason the world could have held her accountable for if she had simply picked up her laundry basket and walked back inside. Nobody would have blamed her. Nobody would have even known. The calculation that most people, most adults, people with fully developed self-preservation instincts and a clear understanding of the cost of involvement, would have made in that alley was the reasonable one. The sensible one. She made the other one. And this is the thing that Valerius Dragos, who had built an entire philosophy of existence on the premise that power was the only reliable currency, found himself unable to file away or rationalize or reduce to a principle he already understood. Because what Odette had demonstrated, without intending to demonstrate anything at all, was that the most significant thing one person can offer another has never been strength. Has never been wealth or status or the particular kind of safety that comes from being feared. It is the willingness to stay. To press your hands flat against someone's wound in the dark and whisper "don't die" to a stranger, for no return, with no guarantee, simply because something in you has decided that their life has value. That decision, made freely and at cost, is the most powerful thing a human being is capable of. It is more difficult than violence. Violence requires only the absence of restraint. Mercy requires its presence. It requires you to look at a situation that is asking nothing of you and choose to give something anyway. Valerius had built walls his entire life against exactly this kind of exposure. He had told himself that the walls were strength. He had not understood, until a 6-year-old girl with a bleach-stained sweatshirt and a wicker laundry basket showed him without a single word of instruction, that what he had actually built was a very expensive, very well-defended distance from the only thing that had ever been able to save him. Every person, regardless of how much power they accumulate, eventually arrives at a moment they cannot buy or fight or strategize their way out of. A moment that requires, from somewhere outside themselves, the simple and irreducible gift of another person's compassion. Valerius arrived at his in an alley off Moran Street, on a cold night, with nobody watching but a child who hadn't yet learned that some people aren't worth saving. She had not learned that. And because she hadn't, he lived. The lesson is not complicated. It does not require a penthouse or an empire or even a name that makes powerful people go quiet. It only requires what Odette had in abundance, the willingness, when the moment comes, to kneel down beside the person bleeding on the ground and decide, freely and for nothing, that their life is worth fighting for. Kindness is not weakness dressed in softer clothing. It is the hardest, most deliberate, most courageous thing a person can choose. And sometimes, it is the only thing strong enough to save a life that all the power in the world could not. That is the story of the alley off Moran Street. That is the story of the cold king and the girl in the green sweatshirt. If it stayed with you, if it left something behind, then hit like and let us know in the comments which moment hit you hardest. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that kindness is never small. And subscribe to Mafia Moonlight Tales, because every story we tell is a story that means something. We'll see you in the next one.